I'm Florence Dew, 29 years old, living in a one-bedroom flat in Brunswick, Melbourne. And 3 months ago, my dying mother handed me something my brother and sister still don't know about. But before I get to that, let me tell you what kind of family I come from. My parents built Dew & Co. from nothing. Dad, Keith Dew, started it in 1991, one small clothing store in Fitzroy. Mum, Aurelie Dew, designed every piece herself on the kitchen table while Scott and I were asleep. By 2010, Dew & Co. had 34 stores across Australia. By 2020, it was worth $280 million. Flagship stores in Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, a name every Australian woman over 30 recognises. Mum and Dad built that with their hands, literally. And then there's Scott, my older brother, 38. He runs the whole operation now, CEO, appointed by the board 2 years ago when Dad's health declined. Scott didn't design anything, didn't build anything. He just showed up in the right suits at the right meetings and smiled at the right people. The family calls him a visionary. I call him something else, but we'll get there. Then there's Hadwin, my older sister, 35, head of brand and marketing for Dew & Co. She's the face, the one doing interviews, flying to Paris for trade shows, getting photographed at Melbourne Fashion Week like she personally stitched every garment. She didn't. Mum did, for 30 years. And me? I'm the one who left. At 22, I walked away from an expected role in the family business to study film and visual design in Sydney. I built brand campaigns, directed commercials, worked with clients from Tokyo to Toronto, won 2 awards nobody in my family ever Googled. To Scott, I was wasting my time. To Hadwin, I was an embarrassment. To Mum and Dad, I think I was the only one still listening. Here's how bad it got. Christmas 2023, lunch at Scott's house in Toorak, 12 bedrooms, a wine cellar, a home gym he's never used. I arrived with a bottle of Barossa Red and a genuine effort to be present. Scott met me at the door and said, and I'm quoting, "Oh, Florence, I didn't think you were coming." I was on the group chat invitation. I had replied yes, twice. At lunch, Hadwin announced she'd just closed a deal to bring Dew & Co. into Southeast Asia. Everyone applauded. Dad smiled. Scott raised his glass. Then someone asked what I was working on. I mentioned a brand film I'd just directed, a campaign for a sustainable fashion label that had just hit 2 million views. Scott said, "So you make ads?" Hadwin laughed. Not a big laugh, just enough. Dad looked at his plate. I drove home alone that night and sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could go inside. 3 months later, Mum was in palliative care at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Stage 4, fast, brutal, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare. Scott visited twice, both times under an hour. He had board commitments. Hadwin sent flowers. She did not come. I was there every day for 6 weeks. I sat with Mum. I held her hand. I watched her get smaller. The morning she died, she asked the nurse to give me an envelope. She said, and these were close to her last words, "Give it to Florence. She'll know what to do with it." Inside that envelope was a letter and a key. I haven't told Scott. I haven't told Hadwin. But in 2 weeks, there is a shareholder meeting for Dew & Co. And what's inside that envelope is going to change everything. Subscribe and follow along. Chapter 2 drops next, and that's where it gets ugly.
The envelope sat on my kitchen bench for 3 days. I didn't open it right away. I know that sounds strange, but I needed to bury my mother first before I could deal with whatever she left behind. The funeral was held at St. Michael's in the CBD. Beautiful church. Mum would have liked it. Scott gave the eulogy. 8 minutes, polished. He mentioned himself 4 times. He mentioned Hadwin 3 times. He mentioned Dad twice. He did not mention me once. I counted. After the service, Scott pulled me aside near the car park, not to check on me, not to ask how I was holding up. He said, "We're doing an emergency board meeting next Friday, Dew & Co. business. You don't need to be there." I said, "I'm family." He said, "It's a shareholder meeting, Florence, not a family dinner." Then he got into his car and left. That night, I opened the envelope. Mum's handwriting was shaky. She'd written it 3 weeks before she died, when her hands were already giving out, but every word was clear. She wrote, "Florence, by now Scott has probably already tried to cut you out of something. Don't let him. The key in this envelope opens a deposit box at Commonwealth Private Banking in the CBD. Box 31. Go alone, tell no one. What's inside will explain everything. I've been planning this since 2011, since the year I watched your father hand Scott the keys to something I built, and neither of them asked me if I was ready. I love your brother and your sister, but I know what they are, and I know what you are. You were always the one who understood what this family built, not the spreadsheets, not the revenue, the story, the identity, the soul of it. They forgot that fashion is not spreadsheets, it is feeling, and you are the only one in this family who still knows the difference. Go to the bank, then call Jessie. All my love, Mum." Jessie. Jesse Parada, 41 years old, Mum's personal solicitor for over 15 years. I'd met him twice at family events. Quiet, sharp, the kind of person who listens more than he speaks. I called him the next morning. He picked up on the first ring, like he was waiting. Jesse met me at Commonwealth Private Banking 2 hours later. Box 31 contained 4 things. 1. A document showing Mum held 38% of Dew & Co. shares in a private trust, separate from any shares Scott or Hadwin knew about. 2. A letter to the board, signed and notarized, outlining her wishes for the company's future direction. 3. A USB drive containing 15 years of brand strategy documents, written by Mum, not the marketing team, not Hadwin, Mum. Every creative direction, every campaign concept, in her handwriting and her voice. 4. A signed document naming me as the sole beneficiary of her trust. I sat in that private banking room for a long time. Jesse gave me space. Then he said, "Your mother was very deliberate. She structured this carefully. Legally, it's airtight." I asked him what it meant in plain terms. He said, "It means Scott doesn't control as much as he thinks he does." Here's what I didn't know yet. While I was sitting in that bank room, Mum was 3 suburbs away doing something Mum specifically warned the board against in her letter. She was in a meeting with a private equity firm called Paxton Group. Paxton Group wanted to acquire a 52% controlling stake in Dew & Co. The offer was $140 million. The company was worth $280 million. Scott had already verbally agreed, and he stood to receive a $22 million facilitation fee paid directly to him, not to the company, not to the family, to Scott. I found out through Hadwin, of all people. She called me that evening. First time she'd called since the funeral. She didn't open with hello. She said, "Did you know Scott is selling to Paxton?" I said, "I heard." She said, "He's cutting me out too. My role disappears in the restructure. They're bringing in their own brand director." Long pause. Then she said, "We should talk." I want to be honest with you here. My first instinct was to hang up. This is the same woman who laughed at me at Christmas lunch, the same woman who told a journalist for Vogue Australia, on record, that Dew & Co.'s creative identity was entirely her own vision. Mum was alive when that interview published. She read it. She didn't say anything, but I saw her face. So no, I did not immediately trust Hadwin. But I also knew that what Scott was doing wasn't just bad for me, it was bad for the 1,400 people employed by Dew & Co. It was bad for every small Australian manufacturer Mum had insisted on partnering with for 30 years. It was bad for everything she built, and stopping it was going to require more than just me. The shareholder meeting was 11 days away. I had 38% in a trust my siblings didn't know about. I had Jessie, I had Mum's letter to the board, and now, possibly, I had Hadwin. Whether I could trust her, that was a different question entirely.
The shareholder meeting was held at Dew & Co.'s head office in Southbank, 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Yarra River, the kind of room designed to make you feel small if you don't belong there. Scott designed it that way, I'm convinced of that. I arrived early. Dark blazer, Mum's watch on my wrist, the one she wore to every important meeting she ever attended. Jessie was already inside, so was Keith, my dad, seated at the far end of the table, quiet, tired, still grieving. He looked older than I remembered, like losing Mum had taken something structural out of him. He saw me walk in. He nodded. That was all. Scott saw me walk in. His jaw tightened. Florence. Flat. No warmth. Scott. Same energy. Hadwin was seated to Scott's left. She didn't look at me when I sat down, but she didn't move away either. That was something. 30 people in that room. Board members, institutional investors, 2 lawyers I didn't recognise, Scots I assumed, a representative from Paxton Group sitting near the window in a grey suit, already looking comfortable, already looking like he owned the place. Scott opened the meeting. Smooth, confident, the voice he uses when he already thinks he's won. He laid out the Paxton Group acquisition as if it were inevitable, as if it were already done. This partnership represents the next chapter for Dew & Co. Global reach, capital injection, infrastructure that a family operation simply cannot self-fund. He used the phrase family operation like it was an insult. One of the board members, Keith, not my dad, a different Keith, Keith Armand, independent director, raised his hand and asked about the valuation. Scott said the $140 million offer was fair given current market conditions. Keith Armand said the company was independently valued at $280 million 8 months ago. Scott said valuations shift. Keith Armand wrote something down and said nothing else. I watched. Then Scott did something I expected but still felt like a slap. He pulled up a slide deck titled Dew & Co. Path Forward. Slide 4 was an org chart. My name was not on it anywhere. Hadwin's name was listed as Transitional Brand Consultant, a title that didn't exist last week and clearly meant we're removing her politely. Scott talked through it without looking at either of us. Hadwin's hand tightened around her pen. I let him finish. When Scott opened the floor, I stood up. Scott said, "Florence, this is a shareholder meeting." I said, "I know, I'm a shareholder." Silence. Scott almost smiled. Almost. "You own a minor personal holding from Dad's gift allocation. That doesn't give you—" Jessie slid a document to the centre of the table. Miss Dew holds 38% of Dew & Co. through a private discretionary trust established by Orally Dew in 2011, filed with ASIC, notarised, fully compliant. It was structured as a blind trust and did not require disclosure to other shareholders until activation. The Paxton Group representative stopped looking comfortable. Scott's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Scott's face did not move, but his neck went red. I've known him long enough to know that's where he shows it. I placed Mum's letter to the board on the table. "Before any vote is taken," I said, "the board has the right to hear the founding shareholders' final directive." Keith Armand picked it up and read it aloud. Mum's words in that room, her voice through someone else's mouth.
She wrote about what Dew & Co. was built for. Not profit extraction, not private equity exits, Australian manufacturing, accessible fashion, 41 suppliers, most of them small family businesses, who depended on Dew & Co. contracts to survive. She named them, all 41. She wrote that any acquisition that removed operational control from the Dew family without a full board vote and shareholder majority was against the founding charter she and Dad had written in 1991. She wrote that she had specifically structured Florence's trust to prevent exactly this situation. She used Scott's name once, directly. She wrote, "Scott is talented, but he is building his future, not ours. Do not let him sell what took 30 years to grow." The room was very quiet when Keith Armand finished reading. Scott recovered fast, I'll give him that. He said, "A letter is not a legal instrument. The Paxton offer is on the table. We move to a vote." I said, "Fine, let's vote." Scott, 24% of shares. Hadwin, 11%. Institutional investors, 27% combined. Me, 38%. Scott looked at the numbers on Jesse's sheet, then looked at me. For the first time in my life, my brother did not have a next move ready. I called the vote. Motion to reject the Paxton Group acquisition. My 38, Keith Armand's proxy representing 9% of institutional shares, 2 other board members, 56% against. The Paxton Group representative closed his folder, stood up and left without a word. Scott sat very still. I didn't celebrate, I didn't smile. I said, "We'll schedule a full strategic review within 30 days. The board will appoint an interim chair while that review is completed." Scott said, "You're not qualified to." "The board will decide that, not you." Keith Armand said, "I'll second the review motion." It passed. I walked out of that room and stood in the corridor and breathed. Dad came out 2 minutes later. He stood next to me, didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother knew." I said, "Yeah, she did." He put his hand on my shoulder, left it there. That was enough.
The story broke before I even got home. I don't know who leaked it. Could have been anyone in that room. Could have been the Paxton representative making calls from the lift on his way out. By 6 p.m, the Australian Financial Review had a piece online. Family coup at Dew & Co. Founder's daughter blocks $140 million sale. By 8 p.m, it was on the ABC newsfeed. By 10 p.m, my phone had 340 unread notifications, and Scott had sent me exactly one message. It said, "You just destroyed this family." I read it once, then I put my phone face down and opened the USB drive. Mum had organised it into folders, dated, labelled. 15 years of work. The first folder was from 2009, brand guidelines she'd written herself. Not the ones currently on the Dew & Co. website, different ones, original ones, with her sketches in the margins, her notes about what each design decision meant, why she refused to manufacture offshore even when the board pressured her to. The second folder stopped me completely. It was labelled Hadwin, for the record. I want to be careful how I say this. I didn't go looking to damage my sister. But what was in that folder was something I couldn't ignore. For 4 years, Hadwin had been presenting Mum's creative work as her own, not borrowing from it, not building on it, presenting it directly. Campaign concepts Mum had drafted in 2016 appeared in Hadwin's 2019 brand presentations with Hadwin's name on the cover. The language was identical, the visual direction was identical. Mum's handwritten notes had been retyped and reformatted. There was an email in the folder. Mum had forwarded it to herself with one line of her own text above it. Her line said, "Keeping this, not for revenge, for Florence, so she knows the truth of what was built and by whom." The email below was from Hadwin to a journalist at Vogue Australia. It contained a quote, "The creative identity of Dew & Co. is entirely my vision. I've been the driving force for the brand since I joined." Mum was alive when Hadwin sent that email. She read it,
and she saved it quietly, and she put it on a USB drive and gave it to me. I called Jesse at 11 p.m. He already knew about the AFR piece. He'd been fielding calls from board members all evening. I told him about the Hadwin folder. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do with it?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "You don't have to decide tonight." I said, "I know, but I need to understand something first. Did Hadwin know about Mum's trust? Did she know about my shares before today?" He paused. He said, "No, she found out in that room, same as Scott." I said, "Then why did she call me about the Paxton deal beforehand?" He said, "Because she was scared, and you were the only other person who might fight Scott. Not loyalty, survival." Hadwin showed up at my flat the next morning, unannounced, 8 a.m. takeaway coffees, like we were the kind of sisters who did that. I let her in. She sat at my kitchen table and said, "I didn't know Mum had given you that much. I want you to know that." I said, "I believe you." She looked relieved, too soon. I said, "I also found the Hadman folder on the drive." The relief left her face. She didn't deny it. That surprised me. I expected deflection. I expected the version of Hadwin and laughed at Christmas lunch. Instead, she put both hands around her coffee cup and said, "I told myself I was protecting her legacy, that I was the one keeping the brand alive while she stepped back." I said, "That's not what those documents show." She said, "No, it's not." Long silence. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to do what Mum actually asked me to do. Protect what she built. That's it. That's the whole plan." Hadwin nodded slowly. I said, "But if you want any role in this company going forward, your work needs to be your work, documented, attributed correctly, starting now." She said, "Okay." Just that, okay. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a fresh start, but it was something to work with. Scott was a different situation entirely. He didn't come to my flat, he didn't call, he went to the media. 2 days after the shareholder meeting, he gave an interview to a business podcast, 40 minutes, calm, controlled, the version Scott the public sees. He said the acquisition would have secured thousands of Australian jobs. He said the rejection was emotionally driven rather than strategically sound. He said, and this is the part that got clipped and shared everywhere, "My sister is a talented creative person, but talent and governance are different things." The comments under that clip were not kind to him. Somebody found his facilitation fee arrangement within 6 hours. A finance journalist published the figure, $22 million, paid to Scott personally while the company sold for half its value. The headline was, "Dew & Co. CEO stood to pocket $22 million in a deal that valued family business at half its worth." By the end of that week, 3 board members had formally requested Scott step down pending a governance review. He didn't step down, but he stopped giving interviews. Dad called me on a Thursday evening. He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Dad?" He said, "Let me finish. I watched them dismiss you for years and I didn't say enough. I told myself it wasn't my place, that you were fine, that you didn't need me to step in." He stopped. Then he said, "Mum stepped in her own way. I should have done it while she was still here." I didn't know what to say, so I said, "You're saying it now." He said, "Yes, I am." We stayed on the phone for another hour, just talking. About Mum, about the early days of the business, about things he'd never told me before. It was the longest conversation we'd had in 10 years. The strategic review was scheduled 3 weeks out. I had 38% of a $280 million company. I had Jessie. I had Mum's 15 years of documented vision on a USB drive, and I had one question the board was going to need me to answer. What happens next?
The strategic review took 3 weeks. I spent most of it in a windowless meeting room on the 14th floor, going through 15 years of financials, supplier contracts, brand agreements, and board decisions. Jessie was there every day. Keith Armand came in twice a week. We brought in an independent auditor from Sydney who had no connection to anyone in the family. What they found was not a surprise to me, but it was documented now, official, on record. Under Scott's 2 years as CEO, charitable partnerships Mum had maintained for over a decade had been quietly defunded. 4 Australian manufacturers had been dropped in favour of cheaper offshore suppliers without full board disclosure. Executive bonuses had increased 34%, while store-level staff wages had remained flat. Not illegal, but not what Dew & Co. was built to be. The auditor put it plainly. She said, "The company is profitable, but it's been hollowed out around the edges." I said, "That's what we're here to fix." Scott made one last move before the review concluded. He called an emergency press conference, stood outside the South Bank office in his best suit, spoke to camera for 12 minutes. He said the review was a personal vendetta dressed up as governance. He said I had no understanding of retail at scale. He said Mum would have wanted experienced leadership, not sentiment. Then a journalist asked him about the $22 million facilitation fee. He said it was standard industry practice. The journalist asked if the board had approved it. He said the board was informed. The journalist read back the board minutes showing they were not informed. Scott said he had no further comment and walked back inside. That was the last public statement he made as CEO. The board voted to remove him 4 days later, unanimous, even the members he'd appointed himself. Some exits you don't come back from. Hadwin asked to speak at the board meeting where the new direction was presented. I'll be honest, I almost said no, but Jessie reminded me that Mum's vision was never about punishment, it was about the company. So I gave Hadwin 5 minutes. She stood at the head of that table and she didn't pitch anything, she didn't sell herself. She said, "I've been presenting my mother's work as my own for 4 years. The board should know that. The creative legacy of this company belongs to Aurelia Dew, not to me. I'm asking for the chance to build something that's actually mine, under proper oversight if the board will allow it." Keith Armand said, "That's the most honest thing anyone has said in this room in 2 years." She kept her role, reduced scope, clear accountability, every campaign documented and attributed correctly going forward. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. We're not there yet. Maybe we never will be entirely, but she showed up honestly. That counted for something. The board asked me to take the chair position. I said yes on 2 conditions. First, we bring in a CEO from outside the family, someone with retail experience and no loyalty to how things used to be done, someone Mum would have hired. Second, we establish the Aurelia Dew Foundation, a dedicated arm of the company funding emerging Australian designers, free mentorship, seed funding, the kind of support Mum would have given if she'd had the structure to do it properly. Both conditions passed without objection. We found our CEO 3 months later. Her name is Paige Sue, 44, 20 years in retail, built 2 mid-sized fashion brands from the ground up, never worked for a company that manufactured offshore. When I showed her Mum's original brand documents from the USB drive, she read every page before she said a word. Then she said, "This is the clearest founding vision I've ever seen for a fashion business. Why wasn't this on the wall of every store?" I said, "It will be." Dad came to the foundation launch. It was held in the original Fitzroy store, the first one, still running after 30 years, same location, same bones. We hung Mum's original sketches on the wall, the ones from the USB drive, her handwriting in the margins, her notes about why she made the choices she made. Dad stood in front of them for a long time. He said, "She never threw anything away." I said, "She was saving it, she just didn't say for what." He put his arm around me. I don't think either of us expected to be standing there together in that store after everything, but there we were.
Scott did not attend. I heard through Jessie that he'd taken a consulting role interstate. I don't know the details and I didn't ask. I wish him no harm, but I also don't carry guilt about how things ended for him. He made a series of deliberate choices, and they had consequences. That's not a story about me, that's a story about him. I changed my phone number, kept 2 family contacts, Dad and my cousin Paola, a textile designer who'd always been quietly kind and never asked me for anything. Everyone else got a boundary, not out of anger, out of clarity. There is a difference between those 2 things, and it took me a long time to understand it. Here is what I want to say before I go. I spent years making myself smaller in rooms where I should have taken up space. I brought my skills to a family that didn't value them, and I kept bringing them, hoping something would change. Nothing changed until I stopped waiting for permission. Mum saw me when no one else did. She didn't tell me, she showed me, through 15 years of quiet preparation, through a key in an envelope, through a USB drive full of everything she'd ever built. She didn't save me, she gave me the tools and trusted me to save myself. If you are the one in your family who is dismissed, overlooked, talked past at dinner tables, I want you to hear this. Your worth is not decided in that room. It never was. Build anyway. Document everything. Find the people who see you before you have anything to offer them. Those are your people. The rest will sort itself out. I'm Florence Dew, Chair of Dew & Co., daughter of Aurelia and Keith, and I'm just getting started.